The mist rolled in thick that morning over the English Channel, and Klaus Richter stood at his post watching the grey water merge with the grey sky. He was 32 years old, an Oberleutnant in the 352nd Artillery Regiment, and he'd already survived the Eastern Front. That alone made him different from most of the men under his command, who were either too young or too old, conscripts filling gaps in a defensive line that stretched impossibly thin along the Norman coastline. It was early, barely past 5 in the morning, and the dampness worked its way through his uniform as it always did during these pre-dawn watches. Salt and wet earth filled his lungs with each breath. Nothing about the moment seemed unusual until he raised his binoculars and looked east toward where the horizon should have been. What he saw made no sense at first. A darkness had formed where water met sky, a shadow that refused to dissipate as the weak sun tried to break through. He blinked and adjusted the focus on his Zeiss optics, but the image only sharpened and multiplied. Ships. Not a patrol or a small convoy, but an impossible density of vessels spreading in every direction his binoculars could sweep. The entire surface of the channel had transformed into something solid, a floating mass of steel that extended beyond his ability to comprehend its edges. His heart began pounding against his ribs in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the slow pace of routine guard duty. This was the moment every German soldier on the Western Front had been simultaneously dreading and disbelieving. The invasion had arrived. Understanding what Richter experienced requires stepping back into the German mindset of spring 1944. Hitler's Atlantic Wall ran from Norway to the Spanish border, a supposedly impregnable chain of fortifications designed to repel any Allied landing. Propaganda portrayed it as proof of German invincibility, but Richter knew better. He'd walked the defences, seen the incomplete bunkers and the gaps in the minefields. He understood that the wall was more concept than reality, more propaganda poster than actual barrier. His artillery battery consisted of solid Czech-made cannons positioned in concrete casements several miles inland from what the Allies would designate as Omaha Beach. The observation post where he now stood gave him a commanding view of the water, and for months he and his men had drilled endlessly, calculating firing solutions and maintaining equipment while staring at empty grey waves. Everyone talked about Der Tag X, the day when it would finally happen, but German intelligence remained convinced the main assault would target Pas-de-Calais. The Allies had executed their deception brilliantly. Operation Fortitude had successfully convinced the High Command that any landing in Normandy would be a diversion, which meant Richter's sector remained dangerously undermanned. The 352nd Infantry Division represented one of the better units in the region, but even it was a pale shadow of the forces that had swept through France 4 years earlier. Veterans from the Eastern Front like Richter mixed with teenage conscripts and middle-aged reservists. They were brave enough and followed orders, but they weren't the elite troops of 1940. They were defenders asked to hold a line that stretched far beyond their capacity to cover it properly. Rommel had spent recent weeks frantically trying to improve the defences. Millions of mines went into the ground, and thousands of steel obstacles appeared on the beaches, devices the soldiers nicknamed Rommel's asparagus. The Field Marshal understood something that Berlin seemed incapable of grasping. If the Allies weren't stopped on the beaches in the first 24 hours, the war in the West would be lost. Allied air superiority meant any German reinforcements attempting to reach the coast would be torn apart from above. The first day was everything, the only day that truly mattered. But on June 5th, a storm had blown in with rough seas and high winds, and the German Meteorological Service confidently predicted impossible invasion conditions for the foreseeable future. This forecast allowed senior officers to relax their vigilance. Rommel himself had left France to return home for his wife's birthday, confident the weather would keep them safe for now. So when Richter took his position in the pre-dawn cold of June 6th, the atmosphere was routine. The storm had passed, but the sea remained choppy. Nobody expected anything to happen. He was facing east when he first noticed something wrong. a flicker at the edge of visibility. He raised his binoculars and felt his world collapse. Not a flicker. Ships. Hundreds upon hundreds of ships, and behind them, impossibly, even more. He swept his view left and right in growing panic. Everywhere he looked, the sea had ceased being water and had become a solid mass of dark shapes. Cold dread crawled up his spine as he tried to process what his eyes were reporting. This wasn't just an invasion fleet. This was something that shouldn't have been physically possible. For a long moment, his brain simply refused to accept the input. The scale violated everything he understood about military operations. German intelligence estimates had suggested the Allies might gather 3,000 vessels for an invasion, and even that would have represented an extraordinary effort. What he was looking at was something else entirely. He attempted to count, but gave up immediately. The futility was obvious. His training kicked in automatically, trying to categorize what he saw. Battleships and cruisers formed the distant core, massive hulking silhouettes surrounded by swarms of destroyers. Then came the others, the endless others, landing craft of every conceivable size packed so densely they looked like iron shavings drawn together by magnetic force. He blinked hard, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. The image remained. If anything, it grew clearer as the sun climbed slowly upward. The official count would eventually confirm nearly 7,000 vessels from 8 nations, making it the largest amphibious invasion force in human history. But Richter wasn't thinking in statistics. He was experiencing a physical presence that seemed to warp the horizon itself. This was a declaration of industrial might so overwhelming it rendered everything he knew about warfare obsolete. Germany had constructed a wall of concrete. The Allies had answered by building a bridge of steel across the channel. His hand was slick with sweat when he grabbed the field telephone. He identified himself to the voice on the other end and reported ships in the channel. The response was tired and dismissive. They'd received reports of a few ships, possibly a raid. He should stand by. He shouted into the phone that they didn't understand. Not a few ships, thousands. The entire sea was covered from horizon to horizon. This was it. The invasion had begun. The pause on the other end communicated disbelief. He could practically hear the man picturing him as a hysterical junior officer seeing phantoms in the mist. The voice reminded him that sea conditions weren't suitable, and their intelligence reports showed nothing. Richter's voice cracked as he shouted that their reports were wrong, that he was looking at it with his own eyes, that for God's sake someone needed to look at the sea. He slammed the phone down in frustration. The scale was too immense to be believed. He tried another line, reaching his commanding officer at regimental headquarters. He repeated his report, this time estimating 10,000 ships. He knew he was exaggerating, but in that moment it felt like an understatement. The major's voice carried skepticism, mentioning the weather. Richter replied that the weather was clear enough to see the end of the world, and it was currently sitting in the English Channel. He requested permission to open fire. The chain of command was paralyzed by imagination failure. All their plans and intelligence reports were being erased by the reality floating just offshore. While Richter stared at the fleet, High Command was focused on reports of paratroopers inland, assuming those represented the main event. Nobody was looking at the water. Richter didn't wait for authorization. He began shouting orders to his men. Roused by the commotion, they emerged from their positions and stared seaward, their faces displaying mixtures of awe and terror. They could see what he saw. The drills were finished. This was real. Heavy shells came up from the magazines. Rangefinders called out numbers that seemed impossibly large. The massive cannon barrels, silent for so long, elevated slowly and pointed toward the impossible fleet. Richter stood at his post with binoculars pressed to his face. He could see landing craft beginning to form up. He could feel vibrations in the air, a low hum from thousands of engines. It was the sound of a superpower breathing, and he was about to cast the first stone. The order finally arrived just before 6 in the morning. Engage at will. For Richter, it broke the paralysis of disbelief. Action provided familiar clarity. He roared the command to fire into the telephone. A moment later, the ground trembled as the first gun spoke. Then a second, a third. The shells screamed out over the water. He tracked them through his binoculars, feeling professional pride mix with mounting dread. Water plumes erupted amid the fleet. A miss, another. His men were skilled. They adjusted aim and fired with disciplined rhythm. For a brief moment, they found their mark. Richter observed a direct hit on what he would later learn was the USS Corey, an American destroyer. Orange flash, black smoke. While some accounts suggest the ship may have also struck a mine, from Richter's perspective, his guns had drawn first blood. The vessel listed, crippled, and would eventually sink. His men cheered. For a few minutes, it felt like an actual battle, like their training mattered. The feeling evaporated quickly. After the Corey was hit, the fleet didn't scatter or slow. The gap in formation simply filled. The endless lines kept coming, an iron tide that nothing could stop. His guns fired repeatedly, but for every ship they might harass, 100 passed untouched. Profound futility washed over Richter. He was a man with a bucket trying to empty an ocean. He looked past his own shell impacts and saw the larger picture. Allied battleships like the USS Texas were now rotating their massive 14-inch guns toward shore. Then the reply began. It started as distant rumbling across the water. He saw light flashes from the big ships, resembling silent lightning on the horizon. Seconds later, the air around him began tearing itself apart. The ground heaved. Earth geysers erupted from the fields. The systematic industrial process of dismantling the Atlantic Wall had commenced. Where was the German response? Where were the Panzers and the Luftwaffe? Richter scanned the sky and saw nothing but Allied aircraft. Fighters, bombers, transports. They owned the air completely. German doctrine called for armoured counterattacks, but the closest unit, the 21st Panzer Division, was paralysed by confusion and the requirement for direct orders from Hitler's headquarters. When it finally moved, it did so without air cover into a sky black with Allied fighter bombers and was decimated before reaching the front. In that moment, with his own guns firing and steel raining from above, Richter understood. This wasn't a fight. It was an extermination. The Allies weren't trying to outmaneuver him. They were trying to erase him. This single personal realization about overwhelming force defined the entire Normandy campaign. As the naval bombardment intensified, something shifted in Richter's consciousness. The tactical portion of his brain shut down, replaced by cold, terrifying clarity. He was no longer seeing ships and soldiers. He was seeing the system behind them. Through his trembling binoculars, he looked past the warships and saw in his mind the assembly lines of Detroit. He pictured factories churning out trucks and engines on a scale Germany could only imagine. The logistics required to supply hundreds of thousands of men on a hostile shore wasn't miraculous. It was the simple result of that industrial output. He looked at the sky filled with endless C-47 transport planes and fighter bombers. On D-Day, the Luftwaffe would fly perhaps 300 sorties across all of France. The Allies flew over 14,000. For every German plane in the sky, there were more than 40 Allied ones. The reason wasn't a failure of courage. It was the factories. Then there were the tanks. He knew the reputation of German panzers. Tigers and Panthers were technologically superior, feared by Allied crews. But that superiority was a strategic dead end. They were complex, expensive, difficult to produce. For every fearsome Tiger rolling off the line, the Allies were stamping out dozens of simpler but brutally effective Shermans. In all of 1944, the United States alone would produce over 29,000 tanks. Germany's peak monthly production never topped 2,000. The Allies weren't planning to win tank battles through quality. They were planning to win by burying the panzers under a mountain of steel. This was the new reality. the industrial equation of defeat. All the talk of willpower and ideological strength dissolved in the face of these numbers. Nazi ideology had promised that a unified, determined people could triumph over decadent democracies. But here was proof that ideology couldn't stop a bomber and willpower couldn't sink a battleship. Richter felt profound, almost spiritual despair. He and his men were good soldiers about to die, not because they were outfought, but because they were outnumbered on a scale that defied comprehension. They were participants in a contest that had already concluded. The entire German army in the West was like a finely crafted sword facing a steam-powered drop hammer. The outcome had never been in doubt. He thought of propaganda posters and the unshakable belief in final victory back home. It was all lies, not just political lies, but mathematical ones. German high command must have known. They must have seen the production charts, yet they had sent him and millions of others to fight an unwinnable war. No wonder that in the war's final year, psychological strain and confrontation with this impossible truth led to rising suicides among officers and soldiers on the front lines. They weren't just fighting troops from America, Britain and Canada. They were fighting the full, unrestrained power of the global industrial complex. As the sun climbed higher, theory became brutal reality. Naval bombardment reached crescendo, constant rolling thunder that never ceased. The concrete bunker shuddered, dust raining from the ceiling. Through the observation slit, Richter watched the first landing craft waves hit shore. Higgins' boats dropped ramps, disgorging American soldiers into the surf. Machine guns in German pillboxes along Omaha Beach began chattering, tearing into the ranks of first men ashore. From his vantage point, Richter could see the terrible drama unfolding, water turning red, bodies piling up. The German 352nd Infantry Division was exacting a horrific price. For a moment, the defence seemed to be holding. Americans were pinned down, but then the industrial equation asserted itself again. Allied destroyers, witnessing the slaughter, did something simultaneously suicidal and heroic. They steamed directly toward shore, some closing to within 1,000 yards, scraping their hulls on sandbars. They turned their guns on German bunkers, providing direct fire support in a move that turned the tide on Omaha. Simultaneously, strange new machines began appearing. Richter watched amphibious trucks, the DUKWs, seemingly drive straight out of the ocean onto the beach. He saw tanks crawling ashore, some equipped with giant flails for detonating mines. These were Hobart's Funnies, specialised armoured vehicles the British had developed to overcome exactly these defences. Germany had nothing comparable. The scene below transformed from struggle into methodical annihilation. German strongpoints were systematically blinded and destroyed by naval shells, tank rounds and bombs. On Omaha Beach alone, estimates suggest the 352nd Division would suffer approximately 1,200 casualties that day, a staggering percentage of its fighting force wiped out in hours. Richter's own battery was now a prime target. Shells landed progressively closer. A direct hit on one gun pit sent a fireball into the air. Another gun was knocked out. His telephone lines went dead. He was isolated, his command shattered. He looked skyward one final time. It was a moving ceiling of Allied aircraft. On the sea, the first landing craft wave was being replaced by second and third waves. Beyond them, the vast armada waited patiently, a conveyor belt of men and material that seemingly could run forever. The Allies would land roughly 1,500 tanks on D-Day alone. The beach battle still raged, but the outcome had been decided. It was just a matter of time and tonnage. The war in Normandy would continue for another 2 months. Fighting in the hedgerows would be brutal and costly, but it would change nothing fundamental. Every destroyed German tank was an irreplaceable loss. Every lost Allied tank was replaced by 3 more. Every fallen German soldier left a gap that couldn't be filled. For Klaus Richter and the thousands of German soldiers surviving that first day, the rest of the war was merely an epilogue. They fought on, driven by duty, fear, or patriotism, disconnected from reality. But the hope of victory was gone, vanished in the dawn light of June 6th. We often picture the Third Reich's end as a slow, agonizing collapse culminating in Berlin's battle. But for the men on the Atlantic Wall, the end came in a single horrifying moment of revelation. It was the moment they saw a fleet filling the horizon, a sky black with enemy planes, and a force that wasn't just an army, but the full crushing weight of the modern industrial world. It was a new kind of warfare, one decided not in soldiers' hearts, but on assembly lines thousands of miles away. And for one German officer peering through his binoculars at a sea transformed to steel, it was the morning he knew everything was over.